Welcome, class, once again to another YouTube PowerPoint lecture thingy, this time on Nietzsche. I would recommend that those students who are doing this for my Comparative Worldviews class, that you go and do your reading questions first, because the second part of this lecture will contain spoilers. And I really would think it's more valuable for you to kind of wrestle with the text itself rather than have me just tell you what it means. And then after you've wrestled, come back and listen to the lecture, and then it would all kind of click into place. That's the theory. Of course, I'm not going to be able to, I don't have precognition or anything to know exactly, or psychic powers to know what you're going to do. But that's what I would recommend. So, let's talk about Nietzsche. We have seen, or will have seen, once we get to next week's class, how nihilism in general developed from atheistic naturalism and romanticism. I'm going to argue that atheistic naturalism has tendencies that push it towards nihilism, as does romanticism. But we're going to spend this time talking about one philosopher who pushed worldview in about as far as you can push it in that nihilistic direction. Although there are many that would argue he's actually existentialist. We can have that debate, but it seems to me he articulates a lot of really interesting and important nihilistic themes and motifs and values that are necessary for existentialism to come later. So let's take a look at his life. Both his grandfather and his father were Protestant pastors, Lutheran ministers. His father died when he was 4, and as a child, and he grew up in a household full of women. He lived with his mother and his grandmother and 2 maiden aunts and a sister. He seemed to be a devout believer in Christianity as a child. He went to the University of Bonn, where he studied theology and philology, that is the study of languages. He angered his mother by dropping theology 1 semester into his first year of university to concentrate on philology, and apparently he was pretty good at it. He later transferred to the University of Leipzig to follow one of his favorite philology professors. He was also very much influenced by the materialist philosophy of that was beginning to become popular at the universities, influenced by figures like Ludwig Feuerbach, who we looked at last week. He, through his philosophy professor's influence, he was offered a professorship at the University of Basel before he had even completed his PhD, his doctoral studies. Soon after moving to Basel, he renounced, in Switzerland, by the way, he renounced his Prussian citizenship and spent the rest of his life stateless. Although he was stateless, he volunteered briefly as a medical orderly when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. But he contracted dysentery and diphtheria. And diphtheria is no joke. Like, I had a friend who almost died from diphtheria in the Czech Republic. They just saved her life. And that dysentery and diphtheria ruined his health, and he had to leave the service. From that point on, he had very bad health, migraine headaches, bad eyesight, bad digestive issues, insomnia, and so forth. Eventually, he became too ill to work regularly. After he took sick leave from the University of Basel, which turned into a permanent retirement at the age of 33, he lived in poverty in boarding houses, and yet he continued to write and publish. Nietzsche also fell in love with this woman, but it didn't work out. She did not want him particularly, liked a friend of his better, and the whole affair the whole situation, rather, there was no affair, cost Nietzsche friendships and tensions within his family. Nietzsche wrote, quote, "Life with women, the highs are more intense and the lows are more frequent." He was quite a comedian. During this period of his life, he wrote most of his well-known works, though they did not sell well during his lifetime. In 1889, there was some sort of situation that happened in the Italian city of Turin, where he was visiting, and that caused some sort of public disturbance. One story has it that Nietzsche saw a horse being beaten viciously by his driver, a carriage. He was a carriage horse. And Nietzsche burst into tears and threw his arms around the horse's neck to protect the horse. It's a great story. Many historians feel that it's probably more more legend than fact. In any case, after that period, he began writing letters that showed he was, in fact, insane. One of his letters had this line: "I have had Caiaphas put in fetters." Caiaphas was the high priest at the time when Jesus was crucified. "I have had Caiaphas put in fetters. Also last year I was crucified by the German doctors in a very drawn-out manner. Wilhelm, Bismarck, and all anti-Semites abolished." So he kind of, at least in those lines, he sees himself as a Christ figure, and it's rambling and it's incoherent. He was bonkers. He was insane. His friends and his mother had him confined to a mental hospital. His mother, after several years, removed him from the mental hospital, convinced that their cures were simply not working, and he died in 1900 from pneumonia combined with a stroke. Scholars have not reached any sort of consensus about what caused his mental breakdown. There are several theories that get floated. Nietzsche is known to have visited a bordello, a house of prostitution, during his student days, and there's a theory that he might have contracted syphilis, and untreated syphilis will, eat away at your brain and cause insanity. Perhaps it was brain cancer. There's speculation that his father died of brain cancer. Maybe it was brain cancer. It might have been a reaction to drugs that he took to help his insomnia. There are some scholars who say that it was just mental illness. It was insanity, schizophrenia mixed with delusions of grandeur that you can detect in his earlier writings, like the writings he's published, because he comes off as very, very proud, like Das Ubermensch. He's the overman, and those delusions of grandeur and schizophrenia just get worse and worse until he finally collapsed. And some scholars say it wasn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough. Nietzsche's writings of this period, when they become coherent, speak of a mystical religious awakening of some sort. There's simply no consensus. Scholars, a century, 2 centuries later, are still arguing about it. Not 2 centuries, a century later, are still arguing about it. His sister Elizabeth returned from Argentina, where she and her anti-Semite husband had gone to establish a Germanic colony, though her husband later committed suicide. She took control of his care and took control of his writings after Nietzsche died. Now, at this point, I would say go do the reading. I would urge you again to stop the video, go do the reading, and because here comes the second part of the lecture, where we get into themes and ideas of Nietzsche. First being the will to power and anti-metaphysics. And for you to understand this, you have to remember what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is the sort of foundation, the unquestioned foundation of all worldviews. The assumptions, very much like presuppositions. So Nietzsche started writing a mere 10 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, and the Darwinian tone of much of his writings is obvious. Nietzsche didn't agree with Darwin about everything. For example, he didn't believe that the human species is continuing to evolve and becoming more advanced. He didn't share evolution's optimism about the way it played into the myth of progress, that we're getting better. Although the myth of progress does slip into his writings occasionally, but he did take from Darwin two major ideas. Number one, that materialism, this idea that that the world is nothing but material matter and physical energy, that materialism alone could provide an explanation for reality, for how the world worked and so forth. That he did not have to rely on an outside force to provide an explanation for anything. He didn't need God, in other words. And as I argued earlier, Darwin was more likely a deist than a theist, but for all practical purposes, God was detached. And this attitude, this vibe from Darwin fit very neatly with Nietzsche's atheism. Nietzsche concluded that God was at best unknowable and probably non-existent. And the second idea he took from Darwin was natural selection, that life at its most basic is a struggle of each against all with no mercy. These two Darwinian concepts, materialism plus the idea of life being a struggle of the fittest with no mercy, along with his atheism, work together to imply several things. If there is no God, then there is no absolute metaphysics, no reference point for our values, no reference point for judging reality right or wrong, good or bad. And that is sort of the point of his madman parable, where the madman throws down the lamp, the symbol of illuminating truth, and says, there's now no horizon. We've mopped it up. We've killed God. We've erased the horizon. How are we going to figure out up and down? Are we not falling in all directions all at once? It's impossible to get your bearings, in other words. There's no solid reference point. Furthermore, therefore, because there is no metaphysics, no standards, no solid standards that transcend this world, the only world of consequence is this world. The material world, the world we actually live in and experience. Any attempt to restrain the struggle of the fittest in the name of some metaphysical values imposed from outside, whether that's human equality or agape, detracts from the value of this world, because these values get in the way of instinct, of struggle, of the dominant rising to the top. This life which is pervaded by this instinctual struggle to rise to the top, this is what he calls the will to power. And he believed that that natural, cultural, and even political developments are the result of this single natural trend that allows for the greatest exercise of power and greatness. Life is constructed in such a way that it allows for the truly great to rise to the top and lets the weak and unworthy sink down to where they belong. So he writes, I believe this is in the Genealogy of Good, the Genealogy of Morals. It might be from the Will to Power. What is good? All that enhances the feeling of power, the will to power, and the power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is increasing, that resistance has been overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war. Not virtue, but competence. The first principle of our humanism: the weak and the failures shall perish. They ought even to be helped to perish. That is some Darwinian stuff right there. Anything that gets in the way of that must be treated with the utmost suspicion and ridicule. It cannot possibly arise from a metaphysical truth, because there are no metaphysical truths, he says, as metaphysical truth, but it could not possibly arise from a metaphysical truth, and the effect of such beliefs would be taking away from the reality of life itself, limiting life, limiting instinct. This is what he calls the ascetic ideal. Besides which, all of these metaphysical and moral truths are only, so-called truths, are only alternate and hypocritical attempts at the will to power. They are subtle ways of dominating others. So, for example, Christian love is really a way to try to dominate and manipulate others so you come out on top. Point 2. No truths, only interpretations delivered by deceitful language. There are no facts, only interpretations, close quote, Nietzsche wrote in his notebook, summer of 1886 to fall of 1887. Being a philologist, a student of language, Nietzsche was used to dealing with old texts that were reconstructions of a reconstruction of a reconstruction of an original text, but the original text had long been lost. It was irrecoverable. Likewise, Nietzsche thought, we ought to consider knowledge as such to be a corrupted reconstruction with no reachable original, no truth with a capital T, nothing pure and disinterested. There's always bias, always an ulterior motive. We are always interpreting, always projecting our perspective. Everyone's always got a hidden motivation. So if you're paying attention, you will hear, like Freud, he is using a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? And the guy that I did my dissertation on, who coined the phrase hermeneutic of suspicion, talked about the three masters of suspicion of modernism: Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. And we'll talk about that later when we critique nihilism, I think, or maybe we'll talk about it when we critique atheistic naturalism. Anyway, hermeneutic of suspicion all the way down, baby. Further, Nietzsche believed that language is a prison house. It creates reality for us, well, reality, quote unquote reality. It considers what we can, it creates what we consider common sense, but it lies. language convinces us that we can talk about things in general, like people are basically good, or things like that. But in fact, language causes us to lie. There are no general truthful descriptions about anything, because all such talk misses the uniqueness of the specific situation in life that is presenting itself to you. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the echoes of Romanticism, of Herder and Hamann here. Nietzsche believed that language, at the very base of its operation, lies. It deceives us. Even if there were absolute truth, then, we could never get at it because it comes to us always through language, and language is inherently deceptive. Everything is interpretation, and no interpretation, no single interpretation or multiples of interpretation can claim to be true, since interpretation is inevitably driven by our own selfish motivations. There is no objective truth, or at any rate, there is no objective truth that can be communicated faithfully by language. So, he writes in his Will to Power notes from 1883 to 1888, every belief, every considering something true, is necessarily false because there is no true world. And I think this is key for understanding Nietzsche. And this comes up in your reading, and this is one of your reading questions. But let me explain a little bit. He believes that truth kind of acts as a vampire and sucks vitality out of the world. The only world that matters for Nietzsche is this world. And if we say something is true with a capital T, or good with a capital G, then that necessarily detracts from the reality of this world, according to Nietzsche, because our saying something is true refers to or is justified by this standard, this what he calls the true world, and likewise this true world stands in judgment of this world. You can't ever be fully present here because you've got this other world judging and as a reference point. Now, whether you agree with him is another thing, but this I think is key for understanding Nietzsche. Therefore, any perspective that claims to have some objective authority in this world, whether it's religious or philosophical or scientific, must be attacked as the will to truth. What is the will to truth? It is a masked and hypocritical form of the will to power. He was especially critical of morality that claimed to be based on some sort of transcendent authoritative truth from the outside, heteronormative, as we talked about last week. Since it could not possibly be, it can't have a reality, it can't be based in truth, because there is no truth. There is only this world, Nietzsche says again and again. And worse, such moralities often get in the way of our instinctual pursuit of the will to power. It gets in the way of the great rising to the top. Okay, 3, master morality versus herd instinct and the slave morality. Nietzsche was a philologist, a student of language, and very concerned about the history of words and what words originally meant. He claimed that the terms good and bad, or good and evil, originated in the ancient world not as moral concepts, meaning virtuous or blameworthy. Rather, they referred originally to class. Here's a long quote from Nietzsche that talks about that. The judgment good did not originate among those to whom goodness was shown, the needy, those who needed mercy. Much rather has it been the good themselves, that is, the aristocratic, the powerful, the high-stationed, the high-minded, who have felt that they themselves were good, and that their actions were good, that is to say, of the first order, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, the vulgar, the plebeian. Okay, so you guys getting it? He is unabashedly elitist. It was out of this pathos of distance that they, that is the good, the strong, the elite, first arrogated, gave themselves the right to create values for their own profit and to coin the names of such values, namely as good. That's from the Genealogy of Morals, paragraph 2. In fact, Nietzsche is wrong on this point. Good in ancient documents in the classical world does not only mean powerful and noble. There were other ways of thinking about goodness in the classical world. Good and beautiful were often explicitly moral terms. But this interpretation is the one of history, of philology, is the one that fit Nietzsche's philosophy best. And if there's no objective truth anyway, then what's it matter if he played a little fast and loose with the facts? Because there are no facts, there's only interpretations of facts, right guys? So, according to Nietzsche, the term we associate with morality originated from the master class, from the elite. These terms associated sprang from nobility, of having high aspirations, of taking and mastering reality, bending it to your will, as seen in the creation of the words good and right, and then the elite applying those to themselves. Nietzsche called this taking reality and bending it to your will. He called it this master morality, the master morality. Those who follow the will to power to seize greatness for themselves. Only a few are fit enough to really take on this task, to separate themselves from the herd. Morality, as we think of it today, having to do with right and wrong and all that, was created essentially to keep people in line, because most follow what he called the herd instinct. They're like sheep. They're not people, they're sheeple. They're like cattle. But the truly great and noble will not be bothered by such arbitrary rules. They will rise to the challenge and master life. They will follow their genius and dominate in a way that shows that they are truly worthy, truly noble. And if you listen carefully, you can hear natural selection again, right? From the survival of the fittest. Nietzsche called such a worthy person the overman or the superman, das Ubermensch. It is in this context of goodness equaling strength, essentially, that Nietzsche tells the parable of the eagles and the lambs. And this comes from On the Genealogy of Morals, Essay 1, Section 13. The sheep may not like it that the lambs swoop down and take one of them away every so often, but he says it would be ridiculous for them to blame them for doing so. They're just being strong. And likewise, it would be ridiculous for the eagles to blame the lambs for just sitting there waiting to be eaten and devoured. They're just being weak. Let me read the quote. There is nothing strange about the fact that lambs bear a grudge towards large birds of prey, eagles, but that is no reason to blame the large birds of prey for carrying off the little lambs. And if the lambs say to each other, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey and most like its opposite, a lamb, is good, isn't he? then there is no reason to raise objections to this setting up of an ideal beyond the fact that the birds of prey will view it somewhat derisively and will perhaps say, "We don't bear any grudge at all against these good lambs. In fact, we love them. Nothing is tastier than a tender lamb." And then Nietzsche completes this quotation by saying this: "To demand of strength that it should not express itself, that it should not be a will to overcome, overthrow, dominate, a thirst for enemies and resistance and triumph, makes as little sense as to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength." Plus, check out his mustache. It is a mighty mustache. Nietzsche believed that when the priestly religions, namely Judaism and Christianity, came to power in society, they effected what he called an inversion of values. They turned the value structure upside down. And how did they do that? They created the category of evil and then applied it to the people who had called themselves the good, the rich, and the powerful. And they did so out of a sense of envy and resentment, or what he calls ressentiment. He uses the French word. So, Nietzsche says, the Christian ethos of love, their belief that you have to love other people, is really a form of resentment. It's a way of consigning your enemies to the flames of hell, of defeating the powerful, at least in your own mind, when you don't have enough power to defeat them directly. In other words, Christian love is really a hypocritical form of the will to power, a will to dominate others. Nietzsche called Christianity a slave morality because it was a way for slaves to try to hate and to manipulate and dominate their masters, their betters. This is from a comic book, a comic history of philosophy, and I thought it was helpful. And it's about a just so story that Nietzsche tells. How did this woeful state of affairs come about? Once upon a time, tens of thousands of years ago, the smartest and strongest of any given group of humans naturally became their leader. I call this person an Ubermensch or Superman. And then you've got these lesser people who aren't as talented and strong. I'm tired of Superman getting all that tail. The Superman kicked my ass for not working in the mammoth pits. I tried to fight back, but he's so much stronger than me. Me must think of something to get that Superman. So the jealous masses banded together and invented religion. And then once religion has been established, I am God. I am an invisible supernatural entity that is greater than the Superman. You must obey me, not him. And because I am invisible, all my commands must be dictated by the priest class, the priest race over here. And one guy says, there is no Superman. All are equal in the eyes of God. Anyone can be Superman. And the Fred Flintstone, the thin Fred Flintstone character says, well, golly. So this is what Nietzsche had believed Christianity had done in Europe. It was to completely invert values. The great and the powerful were now the evil ones, and the weak and the poor and the lowly were now the good ones. Nietzsche said that such an inversion was incredibly unnatural. The values of mercy and equality and universal human rights and even democracy were unhealthy for Europe, since they restrained the great in order to protect the weak and the unworthy. And you might not agree, but that's his take. Ironically, and Nietzsche was always on the lookout for irony, it was Christianity and the belief in absolute truth that would ultimately lead to nihilism. As people found out that the Christian God became less and less believable, they would abandon that belief in God. God is dead. We have killed him. Leaving only Christian morality left. But soon, people, or at least the true elite among the people, would realize that that morality was based on nothing, that it was actually harmful, that it was blunting instinct, it protected the weak, it restrained the powerful, and they would reject Christian morality as well, leaving a nihilism, a vacuum of values. Nietzsche was trying to both provoke and precipitate that crisis of values and give something for the man of genius and strength and domineering will to pursue past the crisis of nihilism. Whether he succeeded in doing so, and whether that was the right thing to do, is a question you will need to answer for yourselves. Okay, that, my dear friends, is the Nietzsche lecture. And hopefully this will help us catch up with what we're doing in class, because we are about a class and a half behind right now. And I am likely going to do the same thing with Sartre and with Kierkegaard, so that we can get through existentialism quickly as well. So please bring your questions. I should have said this at the beginning, but if you have questions, write them down, bring them to class. I will ask you whether you had questions. And because this only works if you guys are truly engaged and not just letting the words wash over you while you scroll Reddit or whatever. So I will see you in class next week, and we will get into Nietzsche after the quiz. Take it easy, and thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.